Let's continue our study of 1 Samuel. We're in chapter 17, and we're going to look at verses 31 through 40. 1 Samuel 17, verses 31 through 40. Before Goliath, there was King Saul. That is, before going forth to fight this giant Philistine, David first had to overcome his own lackluster, unbelieving king. Saul was, after all, Israel's Goliath, the tall, impressive champion who was supposed to bring victory to the nation. But Saul had been intimidated by the taller Philistine, and now he was cowering in fear. So just as David had to pass through the gauntlet of his older brother's scorn, back in verse 28 of chapter 17, he also now had to stand before the king's skepticism in order to get his shot at killing Goliath. So it is with those who fight the Lord's enemies. Most often we have to overcome doubt and skepticism, sometimes of family, sometimes of friends. Much was at stake as David answered the call to appear before King Saul. Israel's army had trembled before this uncircumcised Philistine, and it seemed that not even a man of faith would defend the Lord's honor. Were God's promises for Israel suddenly invalid? Was this hostile power to the great living God of Israel, was he stronger than him? David answered with a resounding no. But first he had to persuade King Saul that there really was a champion in Israel. Saul had somehow through the grapevine heard about David's outrage over the Philistines' defiance, and he sent out a call to have David come before him. And so we read in verse 31, and when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. Up comes a young man, not even dressed with battle clothes, still wearing his shepherd's outfit, whatever that was, coming straight from the fields. But it seemed that his zeal and his confidence overcame the way that he looked. David spoke first. The true anointed leader respectfully brushed aside any protocol as he addressed his failed leader. Coming before the king, David assured him in verse 32, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Matthew Henry sums it up this way: "A little shepherd come but this morning from keeping sheep has more courage than all the mighty men of Israel." So David might have courage, but he still needed the king's permission before facing this Philistine giant. Verse 33 says, Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. So he's looking at David, and he's not very impressed. To Saul, quite understandably, the idea of this young shepherd dueling with Goliath was just outrageous. Saul may or may not have recognized David as the harpist who had played for him and soothed his soul, but the battlefield was a different setting from the throne room, and David's boasting was just a waste of time for the king. First, David had to face the question of his readiness for battle. Saul had declared that he was obviously unqualified as a kid. David couldn't fight Goliath since a boy cannot do a man's job, and fighting Goliath was definitely a man's job. Looking ahead, we realize that Saul expresses the very same opinion that Goliath will say later, looking at David as this runt of a youth in verses 42 to 43 that we'll get to next week. Saul and Goliath have much in common, including an ungodly way of seeing that only sees the appearance. We've talked about that several times. The giant relied on his appearance to frighten his enemies into submission. Saul looked on David's appearance, seeing anything but a champion warrior. But David doesn't look the part of a hero, so he must not be one. Old habits die hard, and Saul was simply unable to look deeper than the outward appearance. He was not able to see anything of David's heart, even though David had come with some very impressive words. David, being respectful, in his demeanor before the king. Nevertheless, he disputed Saul's poor assessment of his fitness to do the job. He assured him that his experience as a shepherd was undervalued when it came to preparing him for battle. Here are the words he spoke that are some of my favorite verses in the Bible. Verses 34 and 35. And David said to Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Oh, I like those verses. I preached on this text on several of my missionary trips, including the jungles of Borneo, now called Kalimantan. Whether the lion or the bear had tried to steal off with one of David's sheep, or whether the animal turned on the shepherd himself to kill him, he had killed the beast and delivered the sheep back to safety. Many people fail to learn the lessons from their experiences, or even learn the wrong lessons. So it matters what we think about our past actions. David might have come away from his experience with a very arrogant overconfidence in himself. Look what I did. At first, it might kind of seem like he's speaking that way, saying, Goliath, no different from the lion and the bears I fought. I can whip him just like I killed them. But that wasn't David's attitude. He had learned not to trust in himself, but in the Lord. True, David thought the Philistine warrior a little more than a beast. He said, this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, in verse 36. But he had realized in defending his father's sheep that it was God who was with him. It was God who protected him. It was God who gave him success in protecting the sheep. This is the lesson that David applies to his new challenge in verse 37. David said, moreover, in addition to what I've just said, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. So David shows where his confidence is. He shows how we should use our past experience of God's faithfulness to us to make us bold in the faith in the future. Looking back in faith allowed David to look forward in faith. What God had done in Israel's wilderness, he will do now in the valley of Elah. This is how our Bible study should build our faith. Not only do we look to what God has done for us personally, but we see in the Bible how faithful he was to deliver his people time and time and time again. And he did this against some of the most extreme dangers. And we are then to be made bold to trust the Lord for our own battles in his name by looking at the scriptures. David's readiness to fight Goliath stemmed from his past experiences in fighting. But it consisted of his certainty of God's power and God's willingness to save him against this ungodly enemy. Here's David's gospel message for unbelieving Saul. Verse 37, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. Arthur Pink comments, the language used by David in the presence of the king was not the bravado of a boaster, but the God-honoring testimony of a man of faith. And so it was. While Saul pined away, looking on the situation only through appearance, David looked at the giant with the eye of faith and the lens of his own experience as it validated the testimony of Scripture. David's experience taught him to believe the old stories of God's mighty deliverances, these stories that Saul had apparently forgotten or he had just disregarded. David saw things theologically from God's perspective, and his faith made him ready to face this giant in battle. Now, if we look in the same way on our situations and a confidence in the Lord based on his proven faithfulness in our own lives, it will prepare us to stand firm in battle against the spiritual enemies that we'll have to face tomorrow and the next day in the future. Along with David's faith, one more aspect showed his readiness to fight the Lord's battles. To see this, we need to return to Saul's initial scorn. For thou art but a youth. Saul dismissed David because of his weakness, but this weakness, coupled with the great faith, made him especially ready to stand before God's enemy. Maybe it was because David was the youngest of so many brothers, the overlooked one who was sent to tend sheep, that he had turned to the Lord as his hope and as his salvation. Being the least significant member of the family and having few privileges, David had come to realize his need of a Savior. That he was always aware of this drove him to faith. And paradoxically, it was his weakness that made him strong, as it is with you and as it is with me. If we ever think that we're capable, in and of ourselves, to fight the Lord's battles, we will lose the battle for sure. Absolutely. The Lord uses the weak in the world to shame the strong. He uses the simple to confound the strong and the mighty. And working off of what we said this morning, that sets us up perfectly as a small church. We're not strong, we're not mighty, we seem to be insignificant. We're exactly the kind of thing that God can use, and I believe he will use in good time. He does that, as Paul says, so that the world will never have any reason to boast, as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29, verses that I cite very often. If we want to fight the Lord's battles today, it isn't enough for us to be ready. We must also enter the fight for the right reasons. David differed with Saul in his readiness. David was qualified to fight because of his faith, not because of his size. And he also differed from Saul because his reasoning about fighting the giant. David made his reasoning very clear. This uncircumcised Philistine hath defied the armies of the living God. That's why he wanted to fight. That's the reason. The first reason that David stepped forward to fight the Philistine was his outrage over this idolatrous pagan's defiance toward his true and living God. We can't let him get away with that. In other words, David was motivated by a zealous concern for God's glory and God's honor. David was awestruck by Goliath, but for a different reason than what everybody else was. David wasn't blown away that someone could be so big, but this uncircumcised Philistine could defy the glory of his God. That's what he was awestruck about. How could he do that, and how can you let him get away with it? In addition, the giants had challenged Israel's faith in the Lord, and if God's people would be more impressed by fear of Goliath than fear by God. David wasn't having it. This was an outrage. This is an affront to God's honor, a smear on Israel's name, a cause that the Lord would surely take up himself as David put the Philistine in his place, namely in his grave. Thus, when David finally stood before the giant, his challenge was filled with passion for God's glory. Look at these words in verse 45 when he spoke to Goliath. Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. Notice that David made no mention to Saul about the great treasures that the king had offered anyone who would take on the giant. You know, no more taxes, you get to marry my daughter, all this great stuff. In light of David's outraged concern over God's honor, these rewards of vast treasures, a royal marriage, and family privileges, they weren't part of his thinking. Even now, before the king, there's no, oh, and by the way, when I kill this uncircumcised Philistine, I expect to get all this stuff that you promised. No mention of that. This battle simply was not about David. He wasn't concerned about his safety. He wasn't concerned about having a better future. Goliath's challenge was a challenge to the glory and the power and the honor of the Lord of hosts. And for that reason, and that reason alone, David was determined to kill this defiant enemy and see God's glory properly restored. This is God's own first motivation in our salvation, to display the glory of his grace. Paul writes in Ephesians 1, 5 and 6, that God predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself. Why? According to the good pleasure of his will. For what reason? To the praise and the glory of his grace, wherein he hath made us accepted in the beloved. We are saved from our sins, Paul adds in verse 12 of that same chapter, that we should be to the praise of his glory. That's why you and I were saved. To give him honor, to give him glory. It's all about the glory of God. It's a comforting thought that the first and primary reason for our salvation is God's glory, because the glory of God is a cause that we can all believe in. Just as man's chief end is to glorify God, it is also the chief end of God, his own glory. We're all on board with this, the glory of God. And we who have looked in faith to Christ can be confident of our ultimate salvation, because it is to the praise of God's marvelous grace. Martin Lloyd-Jones writes, the whole purpose of your salvation as mine is that we should glorify the Father. People come and talk to me, and it's generally put in this way. What will salvation do for me, they ask. And the answer that is given so often in evangelism is believe the gospel, and it will do some marvelous things for you. I say, thank God that is true, but my dear friends, we should not put that first. The ultimate aim and object of our salvation is that we may glorify God. The essence of salvation is to bring us into the state in which we do glorify God. From his book, Saved in Eternity. Notice, therefore, that while David was distressed over Israel's cowardice, he gave no sign of seeking that Israel would be glorified through his victory. So also, in our spiritual labors, we should be motivated not for personal gain or for the prestige of our church or our theological position or even for the reputation of Christians in general. We fight for God's truth because those who defy the word of God are an affront to God's glory. We fight to defend God's name and to pursue his glory in this world. When we wage war for this reason, we can be as confident as David of God's Goliath-killing power. Why do we stand so strongly against Arminianism? Because Arminianism defies the glory of God. It sets man on the throne. It's his free will. It's his decision. It's all about him that gets him saved. And it's a smear on God's name. That's why we despise Arminianism and all the preachers that preach it. Why do we despise this strange fire worship that's so prevalent in churches today? Because it glorifies man. I do not believe in having any of that music going to be sung before the throne of grace. I don't believe any of that nonsense, those wailing women and those drum-pounding beats and those sexy voice gospel boy band singers. They're not going to be doing that in heaven. It's to define the glory of God. That's why we talk against those. That's why we preach against those things. And we will continue to do so. We're going to defend God's name and pursue his glory in this world. Another reason David wanted to fight was to deliver God's people from danger. He was a shepherd after all, and God's flock was intimidated. It was disgraced about to be torn apart. Goliath was a bear from whose mouth God's lambs needed to be set free. If the foe turned to fight, he would have to be killed. And finally, we can add David's full confidence in God's deliverance. Verse 37, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. It's not like, hey, he might do that, he might not. If it's God's will, he'll do that. He says he will. He will do that. This is David's final reasoning for entering into the battle. we likewise should step forward in battle today with a primary motivation of defending God's honor, while wanting to defend God's people and counting fully on God's faithfulness and power to save. And he will, and he does. It's difficult to say that Saul believed David's message of faith, because if the king really believed what David was saying, then he would take on Goliath himself, right? True and saving faith believes in God's grace for ourselves and not merely for others. More accurately, Saul was impressed with David's passion and resolve. Verse 37, and Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Now that statement's loaded with irony, since the Lord had already departed from Saul in order to be with David. Saul wanted the Lord's presence and blessing for someone who would fight Goliath, but his heart was too hardened to repent and seek the Lord himself to get empowered by the Lord to take on the Goliath. Saul reminds us that biblical religion offers God's saving grace only through personal faith and personal repentance. The true and living God does not sell indulgences through third-party vendors. The Lord was already with David because of the faith that he had proclaimed to Saul, a faith that Saul admired in David, but he rejected in himself. As will often be the case with unbelievers who want to benefit from the faith of others, Saul then offered to be an investor in David's saving enterprise. And the verses that are just filled with symbolic and spiritual irony, the king offered to send David into battle wearing his own personal armor. Verses 38 and 39. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put on a helmet of brass upon his head, and he armed him with a coat of mail, and David girded his sword upon his armor. Now, we can look at this in a number of ways. Saul's probable motive was to bind himself to David so that in the rare instance that David was successful, Saul would be able to take credit for, or at least share in David's victory over Goliath. You see, I put him in my suit of armor. Another way of looking at it is this sees a symbolism to the act that corresponds to the truth that we already know. Saul was a king on the way out. David was his designated replacement. However, these views might be, I think the basic reality was that Saul was conveying some sort of goodwill to David and providing his help, but in a way that showed his own reliance on worldly strength. We might picture Saul's offer like this. Here, you're going to go out and fight. Let me help you. Let me help you. Let me give you my seal of authority. Discredited though it was. Take my weapons, useless as they had shown themselves. Go forth in my name, though it is a curse on the lips of every man in the army at that point. What's amazing is that David begins to put this armor on. Over his little tiny torso, Saul's heavy armor goes on. On David's head went Saul's bronze helmet. Strapped to David's side was Saul's heavy sword, probably dragging on the ground. What a picture. We see this, a miniature Saul with his stuff just hanging on him. This, I want you to understand, is a defining moment, though, in David's young shepherd life. Would he step into the persona, the unbelief, the worldly dependence of King Saul? There can only be one answer. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. And David's formal reason for removing the armor was that he couldn't fight in the gear that he hadn't practiced in. I have not proved them. But this cannot be the only or even the main reasons for David's polite refusal. And that's what it was. He was just being polite to Saul. Again, A.W. Pink says this, David quickly perceived that such was unsuited to him. The one who has much to do with God and service cannot employ worldly means and methods in public. The man of faith has no use for carnal weapons. And David realized that and says, I'm not using this stuff. Now, we should probably think of the offer of Saul's army as one of the greatest trials of David's faith. I don't know if you've thought about it like that, but let me tell you what I mean. The sight of Goliath didn't intimidate the young hero. He knew God would handle this blaspheming Philistine just like a bear and just like a lion going after God's sheep. But by far, the most subtle temptation was the offer to step into the shoes, that is, the armor of this disgraced king. David's faith knew how to say yes to an intimidating challenge. It was equally important that his faith knew how to say no to worldly compromise and unbelieving help, which is what this armor represents. Having gotten rid of Saul's armor, David turns now to face the giant in verse 40. He took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had even in his script, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. But it wasn't with just these things that David went forth to fight the giant. He went to fight with a blazing concern for the honor of God, with confidence in the certainty of his promise, and with the Spirit of God. David advanced against the giant, not in the armor and identity of a king, like all the other nations, which was Saul, as we read back in 1 Samuel 8:5. He was relying on nothing really different from the armor and the weaponry of evil Goliath, but he was relying as a shepherd servant of the Lord, defending God's honor and protecting God's people in the power of the Lord himself. In this way, whether he realized it or not, David was identifying with God's great champions of earlier years. Shepherd leaders such as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. These were men who lived and fought by faith in the promises of God. Thinking about this important turning point in David's life, we can't help but think of the Psalms that David wrote, probably later on in life. Was David thinking back on this event in his heart as he turned from Saul, leaving the armor and going to kill Goliath? Psalm 3, 1-3 reads, Lord, how are they incensed that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Selah. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of mine head. Maybe he was thinking that way. How does this interaction between Saul and David translate to battles in our time? What weapons of the world are Christians and churches tempted to use in our attempt to beat back the advances of darkness and worldly unbelief and sin and evil? The answer doesn't stretch our imaginations very far. The Sauls of today want Christians to grab political power so that we can pass godly laws with the same worldly power that unbelievers use to advance their agenda. Let's use the weapons of the world. We'll get good, godly laws passed. That's how we'll defeat evil. Godly laws are great, but the kingdom of Christ doesn't advance through secular legislation. Never has, never will. Others want that preachers must embrace the advertising powers of Madison Avenue, celebrity speakers whose messages are filled with information designed to tickle the ear. That's how we'll take on the world. Other Sauls will turn to the electricity of Hollywood entertainment, telling the churches to recast sacred worship as worldly entertainment and to replace the preaching of God's word with video clips and cute little skits. Behind each of, and I think these are well-meaning people, but behind each of these well-meaning suggestions, just as Saul's armor was offered in goodwill, is the conviction that the battle must be won by the strength of our own hands. Here's how we're going to do it. I get stuff all the time advertising how you can grow your church. And they'll say, this church grew from 50 to 200 in 6 months. And here's what they did. They used Facebook. That's basically what he said. So we can grow from 50 to 100 just by doing Facebook ads. Goliath is mighty and terrible. He has lawyers, so the church has to have its own. Goliath is served by political action committees, so the army of God has to send representatives to Washington, D.C. The Philistine is able to recruit large numbers by offering desired goods and services, so we must make use of this same marketing data to enlist soldiers in Christ's army. The worldly advance is fueled by sensual thrills, so churches must fight back, amplifier for amplifier, light show for light show, and emotional high for emotional high, and then we'll win the battle. What would David say if we were looking at the spiritual challenges facing Christians today? Would he say that God's church must conform its message and methods to match the weapons of the world? Is that what David would advocate? Surely David would challenge the assumption that Goliath has to be killed with our own power, with our own methods, with our own programs. Surely he would answer, as he said to Goliath himself, "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, and the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." I'm going to rephrase that. We don't need your stinking rock bands. We don't need your drums. We don't need your amplifiers and your light shows. We need the Word of God. Amen. If the battle is the Lord's, what are the weapons with which God would have his people to step forward in the battle then? We're not going to use the weapons of the world. Well, the Apostle Paul answered this question pointing to God's Word. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 5. "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringeth into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." Coupled with God's Word is the power of prayer. Paul writes about spiritual warfare that you're very familiar with in Ephesians chapter 6. In verse 17 and 18 he wrote, "And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints." This is exactly how God's champions have shaken the world and cast down strongholds in generations past. John Calvin stood in Geneva's pulpit with a Bible alone, and God raised up a new Jerusalem for the Reformation. John Knox prayed, and Mary, Queen of Scots, trembled at the prayers of John Knox. William Wilberforce stood fast on biblical truth before the assembled powers of his day, and God used him to break the slave trade in England. Like the heroes who have gone on before us, and like David departing from Saul to face giant Goliath, our great need today is simply faith. Faith in God's Word, faith in God's grace to answer prayer, faith in God's power to uphold his people and to preserve the honor of his name, and faith that the battle belongs to the Lord and has to be fought with his weapons. One commentator wrote, "What is needed in the Lord's battle are weapons that will cause people to bow down and bend the knee and acknowledge that the Lord and he alone is God. Only supernatural weapons can accomplish this task." With our eyes fixed on God's power and our aim to preserve God's glory, we at Forest Hills Baptist Church will not use the weapons of the world. We will fight, if we fight the Lord's battle, with his weapons. And the main weapon that he has given us is his sword, the Word of God itself. And this principle applies to our own personal lives as well, folks. What are equal to Saul's armor for us as individuals? Maybe success, maybe material affluence, maybe worldly stature, popular approval. Do we trust in those things for our security? Do we trust in those things for our happiness and for our blessings? The reality is that only with God's word and with prayer can we have blessing and joy and strength of heart and peace of mind. We don't need worldly success in order to persevere in this life with blessing. But we absolutely need God's word and prayer wielded in faith. In the end, if we fight God's battle using God's weapon, relying on God's faithfulness, and seeking to exalt God's glory, we will have the satisfaction of hearing the cheers and the appreciation of heaven itself. Why do I say that? This is what we find in the book of Revelation, where the conquest of God's enemies are celebrated through the valiant warfare of God's people. Revelation 12:11 and 12. They overcame him, talking about us, talking about you, talking about me. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. The heavens are saying, yay, to us, because we're not using the world's weapons. We can't think about David's heroism without realizing that his example points us forward to the coming of God's great champion. He is the royal Savior of the house of David, God's Son, Jesus Christ. From the earliest days of Christianity, God's people have seen David's victory over Goliath as a picture of our deliverance from Satan and the bonds of sin and hell. A guy named Caesarius of Arles, he wrote in the 6th century, 600 years after the death of Christ. All that we read prefigured in David at that time, dearly beloved, we know was accomplished in our Lord Jesus Christ. For he strangled the lion and the bear when he descended into hell to free all the saints from their jaws. This is from an ancient commentary scripture. Like David, Jesus had his readiness to serve the Messiah doubted by those who noted his lack of earthly stature and worldly power. He wasn't a big guy. He wasn't a handsome guy. He didn't have political power behind him. And they thought, this ain't going to be a Messiah to us. But Pontius Pilate, you recall, spoke up for many when he incredulously asked, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Jesus' fitness to save has been seen in the power of prayer to the Father on the previous night. In John 17:4 we read, "I have glorified thee on the earth. I have finished the work that thou gave me to do." And that work was to glorify God. Like David, Jesus had reasons for battling the world that the world didn't understand. Jesus prayed again in John 17, verses 1 and 2. "Father, the hour is come. Glorify thy Son, that thy Son also may glorify thee, as thou hast given him power over all flesh, that he should give eternal life to as many as thou hast given him." Finally, like David, Jesus conquered Satan and sin and death with resources that are not of this world. Peter explained it like this, 1 Peter 1:18 and 19. "For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by traditions from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ as a lamb without blemish and without spot." Jesus wages war today, throwing back darkness and gathering his flock with the power of God's word. He doesn't come as an earthly king, but he comes as a shepherd savior. We read in John 10, verses 14, and then verse 27 and 28, "I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand." Jesus still wages war today, as John saw him in the book of Revelation. Revelation 1:16, "And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength." Do we need the armor of Saul or the weapons of the world with so great a Savior like that leading us? Absolutely not. If the battle is the Lord's, do we need any weapons other than those that he puts in our hands, strengthened by his grace and his faith, our faith? Made ready by faith in him, fighting for his glory, and armed with the resources of heaven's armory, we will surely succeed as the Lord gives us ability to stand and advance. The songwriter, Francis Havergal, he wrote, and you'll remember these words, "Fierce may be the conflict, strong may be the foe, but the king's own army none can overthrow. Round his standard raging, victory is secure, for his truth unchanging makes the triumph sure. Joyfully enlisting by thy grace divine, we are on the Lord's side. Savior, we are thine." Page 493 in your hymnal. Let's pray. Father, you have enlisted us in your army by your grace, and we want to endure as good soldiers of Jesus Christ, and we want to fight the battles that you want us to fight, and we want to use the weapons that you have given us, and we don't want to compromise anything. We don't want to put on Saul's helmet. We want to put on the helmet of salvation. We want your sword of the Spirit, not Saul's gangly sword that would drag us down. We want to stand for truth. We want to stand for salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, through Christ alone. Give us the courage to stand and to withstand, not for ourselves, not so that we might brag what great soldiers we are, because we're weak. We're useless without you. But with your strength and you behind us, we can be more than conquerors. We can be more than conquerors. And that's what we want to be, for your glory. Not for our glory, but for yours and yours alone. To God be the glory in Christ's name. Amen.